This is part of a longer paper which will be the Shi Xiaoyan lecture at the University of Hong Kong in late October. I put myself down to talk about all sorts of things of which there will be no time. Where this goes, which is the advance on here, please? Could you just show me? I'm not used to this gear. I follow through with the arrow, it's easier, it's more cognate. Very much. I'm going to zoom in certain parts and then go slowly in other parts. Zooming first of all. The idea that there's some bifurcation between traditional modern and Western style modern in Japan is of dubious value. Not only do Fauvist avant-garde artists like Yorosu Tetsugoro simultaneously with their avant-garde work do ink paintings, but great modern Nihonga artists like Tsuchida Bakusen are the members of the same art groups in Kyoto as people who later became renowned as Cubist painters, following on 3 visits to Japan, like Kuroda Jutaro, unfortunately a Kyoto artist and therefore not as well known outside Japan as perhaps historically merited. And by the end of the 1920s, a kind of hybrid oil painting had developed with long flexible outlines and full chromatic range of earth hues and sharp blues and crimson, which were linear structures and colours entirely compatible with pre-Meiji ukiyo-e and kimono designs, remembering that Umehara's family were Kyoto kimono merchants, so he knew about kimono design since childhood. The artist I'm going to look at is not really an artist in the conventional fine art sense. He's a practitioner of visual culture using the medium of photography, but many of his works would, I think, perhaps now be seen from a more considered art position. And he became a photographer in a particular context. Photography had arrived in Japan in 1856 with the work done for or by, we're not sure, Shimazunari Akira. And a long gap exists before the rise of modern photographia printing for widespread publication in magazine illustrations of the early 1920s and artistic photography in the late 1920s. Well, it depends who you call, what you call them, but around 1920 anyway. So by the 1920s, the era of Modern Boy, Modern Girl, which some of you recall was an important exhibition with which I was fortunate to be associated in 1998 in Sydney, we have a very developed photographic discourse in Japan, but also with its reference to art photography, but also a large printing industry which can produce photogravure supplements. As you can see, the one on the right is a photogravure supplement for the commemoration of the Great Earthquake. And certainly from the early 1920s, and perhaps we can go back a little earlier than that to the 1910s, notable realistic paintings seem to have absorbed a photographic eye. Sometimes it's difficult to tell whether it's a photograph or not. Certainly if you see it in black and white illustration, it's difficult. And photographs themselves could be exhibited individually as a kind of pictorialism. Photographs had long stood as reference material for portrait paintings or for reportage. For portrait paintings such as the work by Takeuchi Seiho, The Rain, where you can see we actually have the original photograph he used. And this kind of slipping backwards and forwards is very well known in the 1910s to 1920s, as well as a widespread use of photojournalism, reportage imagery, from the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 where it's sometimes difficult to tell exactly which photograph the artist, in this case an artist who went to the front, as I Chu, has seen, and seems to be incorporating bits of other people's photographs into basically war record art. Other tendencies in art alongside photographic domination of the visual from the 1920s exist. And also, one may say that photographic, photojournalistic art is behind, or is the basis for, the very important, widespread, and recently, to some extent now, studied in English language material of the work done as war reportage painting during the Second World War, and the artists themselves of the war reporting painting were sent to the front. And in some Japanese art journals, the number being restricted and only a few titles being published, such as Shinbi Jutsu there, the artists were themselves the subject of portraiture in the photographic magazine. Now, this war painting was very, very popular in Japan at the time, and the war artists became something of media stars in the limited amount of material which was published. Hinokuma Genshiro is quite important because he's one of the few artists who went to Burma, who recorded the Burma Railway in a famous painting I'm not illustrating. And actually, he was an artist I interviewed before he died. He's also knew Albert Tucker when Albert Tucker went to Japan just after the war. Alongside the relationship with photojournalism, which more or less informed what is generally called the new production school, Shinsei Takoha in Japan, reportage, in other words, war reportage painting. There is also a new interest in the position of photography as a modernist device, whether it's of dream sequences, as you can see on the left, or a new kind of representation of the body as a landscape of desire on the right. And this is all more or less around by the early 1930s, and there's some even earlier examples, and I'll come to those, indicate some of those in a minute. Another direction is taken by the general mood of expressive naturalism in value, or subjects considered to be in Japanese manner, Nihon Teki, Nihon Fu. And this informed a wide range of salon paintings, but sometimes in the photographs of the early 1930s, you can see direct production of sometimes constructivist, sometimes naturalistic or anti-naturalistic effects using natural motifs, which then creep into Nihonga painting, this very famous painting by Fukuda Heihachiro, which seems to anticipate many areas of post-war North American painting in 1932. So we are dealing with a world where many of the same technical devices which inform European art have been accepted, at least by the Japanese avant-garde, and indeed, in the case of Fukuda Heihachiro, are becoming much more widely known than simply that. Hamaya Hiroshi emerged from a particular background. He belongs to that stratum of lower middle-class urban dwellers, known as shomin, who were not high samurai and descended in some ways from the lower samurai and craftsman classes of Edo. His father was a detective, and one may suppose a policeman's diligence underlies. I'm going to skip that bit. This is him. And we notice in his photography an attention to detail which might perhaps be attributed to this diligence in his father's profession. There's also a certain impatience with formal schooling. He changed school many times. And another feature which links many of the photographers, particularly the 1930s, is early experience of major urban catastrophe, if not family trauma. He experienced the Kanto earthquake in 1923 when he was 8, so it's only 9 years before this. He's like many of the photographers in the 1920s. They're given for cameras by a family member or a friend of the family. He was given a Kodak Brownie when he was 15. And like a lot of other photographers in the 1930s, much like in Australia, one presumes, I'm not sure if the periodization is quite the same, but anyway, he switched to a Leica. Immediately, Leicas became available, single lens reflexes, in 1935. So the feature which is always commented on in Japan, a very little or very almost not perceptible technical gap between the materials that modern visual art people use, or photographers in this particular case, and other parts of the world, begins really in the 1920s and certainly by the early 1930s. There's no gap really, technological gap, with the equipment that they use. He first used his Leica to photograph, as on the right, downtown pictures of Ginza and Asakusa. And the photographers of the early mid-1930s automatically used collage to create large multi-image image-scapes, where the, if you like, the visual grammar of the imagery somehow was analogous to or genetically linked to the way of living in a modern city. And you can see that again here with the comparison between Hamaya Hiroshi on the left, a picture of the reflection in a window of a cafe, famous feature of Ginza life in the mid-30s, and then another contemporary photographer who took street realia scenes. It might be interesting just to point out a few features of the history of photography in the mass sense in Japan, which were pointed out to me by Kaneko Ryuichi, the photographic scholar at the Tokyo Museum of Photography. In the late 19th century, photographs were circulated by the US agency Underwood and Underwood, but by the 1920s and 1930s, were circulated by agencies such as Black Star in Germany, UPI, and AP from America on a contract basis. By the 1930s, just as Hamaya himself was learning photographer, professional meant either a studio photographer, basically doing portraits in a studio, or a photojournalist. In the 1930s, saw the rise of Japanese photojournalism, particularly of the streets, and particularly, as you can see in this image, which must have been using Leica in sort of instantaneous slashes of life photography. And this Japanese photography was not isolated. It was quite strongly linked to foreign markets. This is the work of a photographer later known for his pictures of down and outs in Tokyo, Domon Ken, after the Second World War. And this, I'm sure some of you will have seen this very famous picture of a doctor addressing a bunch of nurses, graduating nurses. But this actually is the German version of the image, which was actually, the other images are inside this Sashin Shuho Japanese photography magazine, which, as you can see, was published 5 months earlier in the same year. So images are circulating between Japan and foreign sources very easily, very quickly, and that means the contractual, because it's not circulating electronically, it's not being sent by the then very primitive electronic fax methods which are available and only used for important news photographs. But there's a contractual relation which allows these images to circulate between the Far East and, in this particular case, Germany, but also in America. And this circulation of images between different sources, particularly where the boundary between an art photograph and a journalistic reportage photograph of the street is very strongly blurred, continues into the Second World War, after the Second World War, I beg your pardon, with the very early news magazines, which is Shukan San News from 1949 on the left, or the same particular editor, who was also involved in producing Japanese war propaganda, in a whole series of picture books. And those of you who read Chinese will notice that these are largely Chinese sites. And then war of the Japanese, disasters of the Japanese, and so forth. There are kind of a simulation of reportage imagery to a book publishing form, which has, in its layout at any rate, a certain kind of artistic quality to it. And here we have to think of Neue Sachlichkeit, new thinginess or new objectivity, which is becoming quite evident certainly in painting and photography by the end of the 1930s by the end of the 1920s in Japan. And this is the context in which Hamaya is beginning to work. We also see in 1931 a very big exhibition in Japan of German photography, which toured between Tokyo and Osaka, of an exhibition of work which had been shown in Stuttgart, and again that illustrated magazine, that German one which we produced, the Domonken, was published in Stuttgart already in 1929. So to list them up, the German photography included photograms, photomontages, small camera cityscapes, X-ray and microscope photography. There's only a gap 1 year or something, not even that. Hamaya became interested in these new phenomena, and he wanted to, in a certain sense, cast off this naturalism. This began in his work of, just around the beginning of the Second World War, remembering the Sino-Japanese War lasted for 8 years and began in 1938, the year before this. And indeed, many of these aspects of street photography in Japan were carried over to photography of the wars on the mainland, particularly the war with China. You can see the Hamaya's work in the street, kind of, we would probably call it cinema verité anyway, but it's a sort of reportage of the street, and very often catching different customs. Some of you will catch the flavours of different, the so-called Western style and so-called Japanese style hairstyle of these two young flappers going through the streets of Asakusa, I presume, in that area. But at the same time, you'd be taking pictures of basically travelling merchants. People think that, or sometimes seem to think that Western modernism occurred in a vacuum and it never reached outside Europe unless it was some kind of imitative, rather second-hand version. This isn't true. Never was true. It's just it's a perception of artistry's novel, an almost privileging narrative about modernity. For example, Mohlinage's theories were translated into Japanese by 1929. We see the beginnings of this sort of Bauhaus decorativism in as early as 1925. I'm sorry, this is a very bad picture, but it's from a very small illustration. And this kind of moving an image between in a sort of abstract space is already there with Hamaya in the 30s, and the late 30s in this case. So and also I should say that, I'll go back. I'll just go back to this one. Some of you will have noticed the resemblance with Brassai. 1939, 2 years before, Hamaya had resigned from the Oriental Photography Company And they gave him a present when he left that company, and the present they gave him was a copy in French of Versailles, Paris de Nuit. So it's not in some. What I'm trying to suggest is that modernism is not in some other space, and therefore it becomes quite obvious that when Hamaya plays around with this stylistic modernism in the late 1930s, he should be perfectly well aware of the work of Man Ray, Dulac, Montmorency, and André Breton. I now want to turn to the 8-Year War, and I think I have another 10 minutes. Because we sort of went out of schedule, and I wasn't quite sure what we're doing. Hamaya is very interesting. He becomes a war photographer, although not for the most imperialist photography company, which was a different one, run by a different editor to the one he found himself in. And he starts taking photographs which are basically war hero photographs, in photographing in 1939 the Takata ski regiment on exercise in the deep mountains of Niigata. But this, like a few other Japanese artists and photographers, becomes an opportunity for him to discover what the Japanese village was, or what kinds of cultural values were encoded in the customs that the Japanese villagers brought into their everyday life and into their production mode. And that becomes a major theme of his work, and it's probably the only thing we've got time to look at up until the mid-1950s. And he begins in 1956 in a famous photo album called Yukiguni, or Snow Country, followed by, in the next year, Ura no Nihon, the back of Japan, but by that sense, the beyond the urban, beyond the conventional rural Japan, in 1957, to look back and to reuse imagery which he started to take at the same time as this 1939 Snow Army propaganda picture. And there are actually links with other kinds of propaganda pictures going back to the early 1930s that we didn't go into. For in Niigata, Hamaya began an association with ethnologists and folklore collectors, and that would last for 15 to 20 years. He later acknowledged his humanist philosophy in the following way. And very interestingly, Hamaya is not a literary philosopher, photographer, that's to say, a photographer who comes from a surrealist or poetic background, graduating from a literature department. He didn't go to university. He actually acquires his literary and humanist philosophy existentially by actually working in the field. It's a very special kind of relationship to his subject matter. It's not an intellectual imposition from outside, I think. He says, for example, in Yukiguni in 56, in this wintry village of just 25 roofs among the valleys of Echigo, when one sees the classical form of a magnificent way of living, one can envisage the richness and depth of the spiritual life which has passed through such a long history. To harvest rice is not just an exchange of energy via physical labor. A deep confluence with the gods was required in the hearts of the farmers who built a national land from the impoverished Japanese archipelago. He was linked with a particular ethnologist called Shibusawa, who's actually an aristocrat, privileged person, who collected objects from all over Japan. He was into basically folk things. And this ethnologist called Shibusawa pressed for the work of excavating the culture of the common people against that of the ruling class. So if you like, there's a kind of nativist oppositionism in play in the photography of farmers by Hamaya, which we see in the Blind Woman Reciters image, the Cosette of 1939. And it's the same, as you can see, very interestingly putting these images alongside each other. They're not usually done so, but there seems to be the same kind of sensibility of a kind of erotic resistance to conventionality in the photographs backstage of Asakusa dance girls, and there are quite a lot of those. Here is one of his most famous images, and we have heard Kurosawa mentioned today. This is the background to Kurosawa's imaginary, visual imaginary, the world of peasants living in a kind of mythological space, walking out along, shouting to keep the birds from coming when they're... I'm not quite sure why they struggle to drive the birds away. Presumably even in the snow they have some crops which are vulnerable, or... this is not made terribly clear by Hamaya, who wrote, by the way, an autobiography in Japanese, which is very well worth translating, but hasn't been attempted yet. I'm not going to do it, but somebody can do it. Hamaya was simultaneous with these images. He's actually making war propaganda pictures, very, very cleverly climbing up on a fire ladder to photograph the Marines parading across the path, or engaging in what he later described as shameless deception by massing images of tanks in a multi-collage from a magazine. If I'm right, this one is from front, but I can't remember exactly. There were 2 or 3. There was Nippon, there was Front, there was Graphic, 3 early wartime graphic magazines which produced propaganda. Hamaya is one of the few photographers to express regret for the direction taken by his wartime work, but he does it more as a disappointment at his loss of status as an independent photographer and at the mendacity of wartime propaganda photographs. He recalled in 1970, 25 years ago, I recalled many thoughts whirling around as a member of the Taisho generation, the generation born between 1912 and 1926, which had the most sacrifices forced on it during and after the war, a sense of a stolen youth, basically. It becomes a question then, how did he find his way out of the war? Because he experienced firsthand the extraordinary and horrendous, unspeakably horrendous destruction of the Second World War, particularly the firebombing of Tokyo, and of course the atomic bombardment of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he kind of decides to go back inside either the grotty survival in the terrible urban conditions of First World War Tokyo. This is photographs by another photographer. Oh, and you notice the Charlie Chaplin figure there in the foreground. These are people actually queuing up for rice rations. And some of you who've seen Yoidoro Tenchi, Drunken Angel, an early Kurosawa film, will immediately notice this is like one of the compositional arrangements in that film. We could go on and on about those sorts of relationships. And then for his first book, he publishes Yukiguni, this is it, with that famous photograph we've seen already. I'm going to jump forward. By the 1950s, Japan wasn't isolated from American photo magazines. There was a different function for photo magazines in Japan, because amateur photograph magazines, How to Do It magazines, also included photographs which were of a, quote, non-journalistic artistic nature. And many of the photographs that appeared before 1956, before this book, were actually published in amateur photographic magazines. And then from 1956, this is the first one, there was a market to which photographers could, something to do with the use of visualization in Japanese culture in general, but too complicated and probably too impossible to talk sensibly about. A large number of photo albums were produced by artists doing themes, by photographers doing themes about particular subject matters or groups of photographs. Some of these photographs, in the case of this image on the right, go back to 1940, even though it's only published in 1956 in the book. And in this case, also, we have very strong links to American photography through American photographic magazines, which were all seen by the Japanese photographers at the US Information Center in Tokyo, and by returnee photographers such as Ishimoto, from America, who's 2 years later publishes this album. And also by the widespread use of photo essays in literary or intellectual text, particularly the frontispiece. This is one in the famous magazine Shuo Koron. I think I'm going to bring this to the end with just a few images which are of some power. Hamaya didn't rediscover the folk in quite the way I think he probably anticipated discovering it, when he started out recording folk customs and taking things back to Tokyo for this museum, for Shibusawa's museum, which is in fact destroyed during the Second World War, or during the firebombing to be more precise. He wanted to show that the Japanese countryside was a repository of people surviving under very, very severe environmental conditions and having a kind of lateral relationship through their production of rice or fish in this case. And alongside that was a sort of pleasure in everyday life. He moved later to almost deny this humanistic tendency and took largely geological pictures of geological formations. Our beautiful Japan, but an interesting Japan with no people in it, and produced these extremely powerful imagery of people engaged in quite horrendous cruelty they subjected themselves to in order just to grow rice in the northern cold parts of Toyama Prefecture, for example. It was images like this, and this image afterwards of a child carrying a child through the snow with this text. None of this is, by the way, is translated in the Hamaya catalogue from Getty. None of this information is there. So something of an irritation to see what they have done with the same material that I've worked on for a couple of years. I must tell you, each of these images has got a text on the back page which tells you what the photographer thinks in a kind of literary frame about the image he's looking at. It's not beautiful Japan, it's not wonderful cultured Japan, it's severe, difficult to survive by the skin of their teeth, and a great deal of human heroism. Did they survive? And cruel. I mean, look at this. The girls, and he says at the bottom, even here, all one can do is await the destiny of a woman's life. It's a kind of commentary about. So it's really like the kind of photojournalism he'd seen, I think, from life, and by that time, I would imagine, from Paris Match and so forth. Going to China, I'm going to finish very soon. And I have to show you this because you've seen that image before, Cartier-Bresson. It's actually Hamaya in 1956. But you haven't seen this image before. This is the only image I've ever seen of Zhou Enlai talking to Mao Zedong in this informal manner. And it's almost as if he knew exactly what he was doing when he took the photograph, and the kind of access he had. The thing that put Hamaya off was the brutality with which the riot police suppressed. This is not a communist, this is not a Marxist, but he witnessed the suppression of the anti-security treaty demonstrations in 1960. And he produced them in this Kari to Kanashimi, this, again, transformation of the photo book from what would become a kind of elegant but sort of hard-boiled, realistic look at country life into a political demonstration. And it's interesting to compare that with The Family of Man, which his work in The Family of Man, you've already seen it. I'm very sorry, the image at the top right, you've already seen. He produced an entirely different view of the Japan that he thought so much about, and that gained him the first Japanese photographer to become admitted to Magnum, the photojournalist agency of Robert Capa and Cartier-Bresson. So this is a very interesting life, also because it's got a biography, and also because actually in the day of her death, in the year of her death, in 1985, Hamaya published his wife's journal. But it's a kind of anecdotal, not quite a journal, but description of her life through little vignettes. Who he'd photographed, who he'd met in the north in the immediate post-war period, and photographed here, with obviously references to ukiyo-e on this side and the elegance of the tea ceremony on the right. So this is this tells you this is a quite different relationship to Japanese tradition and cultural value than perhaps we're familiar with. And I better stop.